Chicago, November 14th, 2019. The Thursday when the wind felt like it was carrying grains of glass. I was parked under the Kennedy overpass, the dashboard casting a pale glow that barely hid the fact that my life was just as cracked as the side mirror I still couldn't afford to replace. I had promised myself the night would be short. One more shift, a few more rides, and maybe I'd finally get enough together to pay the last warning on the electric bill. But as far as I know, routine only exists so dissonance has somewhere to hide. The first 3 hours passed in the predictable rhythm of any late night. The car smelled like old peppermint from the gum I'd left in the console, the playlist drifting between tired jazz and EDM that thumped low in the gut. Those tiny constants, the light, the smell, the worn texture of the steering wheel, were all I had to keep my head in place. When life collapses on the outside, you cling to whatever still feels stable. And that's exactly how I knew the moment the world shifted. My first ride that night was Tom, a student, exhausted, backpack half open, sandwich half eaten, cologne cheap and shark. He talked about an exam, laughed at a comment of mine, left a crumpled receipt on the seat. Normal. Perfectly normal. The second was a musician named Alina, still carrying the sweet scent of hot tea in her coat. Those two rides set the pattern that made it possible to notice the thing that didn't belong in this world. Because the third stretched reality to its breaking point. When the request came through, Martin, pick up in the same dark strip under the Kennedy, I didn't feel fear, just that quiet discomfort that warns you a mistake is approaching. The sodium lamps flickered over the wet asphalt as if trying to hide something. And for a moment, the wind seemed to stop circulating inside the car, like something outside was breathing in my place. That's when he entered. He should have opened the door like any passenger would, but something about the way he leaned in, more like sliding than stepping, didn't fit the logic of human movement. He didn't look at me, didn't move his hands, didn't adjust his clothes. He just said, in a voice far too cold for a living body, a single word: drive. And in that instant, my whole body understood before my mind did. He hadn't approached from the sidewalk like the others. He entered like someone who no longer had any side of life left to stand on. The air around him didn't carry warmth, didn't have the rhythm of breathing. The smell, metallic, like iron held too long in a clenched hand, stuck deep in my throat. And when the glow of the dashboard finally touched his face, I saw the detail that shattered any hope of a logical explanation. Nothing about him looked like it belonged. Not to the car, not to the city, not to the living side of things. We were maybe 15 minutes into the ride when the idea of sleeping stopped being an option. His stillness felt posed, like a silhouette pressed too tightly against the world. I noticed the wetness first, a thin sheen at the corner of his mouth, clear and unnatural, like condensation on glass. Then his jaw slackened further, revealing lips that looked almost colorless. Something in me, the part trained to match tiny human details to normal explanations, reached across automatically. My fingers brushed the inside of his wrist, searching for that familiar, eager pulse that always pushes back against your thumb. There was nothing, not even the ghost of a rhythm, not even the faintest whisper of "still here." The radio kept playing, a soft, mindless melody that felt obscene in the silence. For a moment, instinct took over, not courage, just procedure. I pulled over beneath the jagged shadow of the overpass, hazard lights flickering weakly across his lap. When I dialed 911, my voice didn't sound like mine. It was steady in the way a cracked cup still holds water for a moment before giving out. Male passenger, unresponsive, no pulse. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost too calm. She asked if I could begin compressions. I stared at Martin's chest, at the way it didn't rise, at the way the air in the car didn't seem to move around him at all. I don't think I can do that in here, I said. My tongue felt heavy, metallic, like I had been licking a battery, or breathing something I shouldn't. The dispatcher kept talking, but her voice felt distant, like it was leaking through the speakers instead of the phone. I hit the app's emergency button out of habit more than logic. The screen lit up with small digital politeness. Your safety report has been sent. I typed a quick note, passenger unresponsive, but the letters blurred on the screen. Not from panic, from something else. A sharp bang on the window snapped me back. A man in a hoodie stood outside, someone who had been smoking near the curb. His flashlight beam cut across the passenger seat, and he froze. "Hey, is he breathing?" he asked. But even as he said it, his expression changed. Not fear, recognition. Like he was seeing something he'd seen once before and hoped never to see again. He stayed by the driver's side, shoulders tense, hands deep in his pockets like he didn't want them free. Together, we followed the dispatcher's instructions. I tilted Martin's head the way training videos showed, 2 fingers under the jaw, gentle pressure. His skin felt colder than the air in the car had any reason to be. No obstruction, no movement, no breath. The city sirens in the distance should have been a comfort, but they weren't. They sounded slow, as if they were coming through a thick layer of water. Time stretched thin, tightening around the car. And then something small, quiet, but unmistakable happened. As I leaned close to check for breath again, the cold air near his lips warmed, as if something exhaled, but not from him, through him. And the moment it brushed my cheek, every part of me understood the one truth I had been trying not to think. Whatever was sitting in my passenger seat, it wasn't dead, and it wasn't alive. Officer Ramirez pulled up first, a cruiser idling with its lights off to avoid creating a spectacle in the middle of the underpass. He approached with the cautious, ineffable authority of someone trained for scenes that are messy and human. He did not shout or overreact. He ran through the same checks I had tried to do: airway, breathing, a carotid pulse. I remember the soft clink of the officer's boots on wet pavement, and the precise way he said, "Sir, can you hear me?" When he confirmed there was no pulse, the tone in his voice changed a degree. Professional, contained, with an ease that had earned him the right to be clinical. By the time the EMTs arrived, an ambulance's siren was a high thread through the underpass din. EMT Sarah stepped out in her reflective jacket, and everything became choreography. A quick voice report to her partner, a bag opened, gloved hands slipping into place. She did what EMTs do: checked vitals with practiced economy, shone a light in the eyes to look for reactivity, listened for breath. When she pronounced that there were no signs of life and that further resuscitation wasn't indicated, she did it without drama. Her voice told me what I had already suspected but had been refusing to name. "We can't do anything more here," she said. "He appears to be deceased." The words landed with the flat weight of procedure. Even then, there was tenderness. They covered Martin with a light sheet that wasn't quite big enough and waited for the coroner. Officer Ramirez asked me for my statement and took my phone number, the way they always do when there is a person in need and a driver who will carry the memory. He touched my shoulder with the kind of human contact that says, "I know what you saw, and it will be part of you." I remember which hand he used and how brief it was. The coroner's team arrived, methodical and meticulous. They photographed the scene, noted the position of the body, and began to secure the vehicle. I stood a few feet away, wrapped in the city night and a jacket that smelled like peppermint and street food. The technician asked for the car keys. They went through a checklist. Do you consent to a search? Do you have anything to report? They bagged items by the seat: a lighter with a faint burn mark that matched the scorch near the cup holder, a crumpled receipt, an old gum wrapper. They cataloged with a kind of quiet reverence for details that would become part of a formal record. Chain of custody, they said. Evidence must be preserved.
When the photographer lifted his camera, the flash sounded like a small gun, and the images cut into their clipboard as if to say, "Here is the moment you can't take back." The police took a statement from me about route and timing. They matched the trip on the app to the GPS trace and assigned it a case number. Someone from the department asked if I had any relevant medical knowledge, if I'd administered first aid. No, I told them. They asked if I had done CPR. I said I had not, and that the dispatcher had advised against it in the circumstances. One officer stood by and called it in. Unattended death, possible cardiac arrest suggested by position and scene, nothing overtly suspicious. That phrasing, unattended death, felt like an official way to fold a life into a file. The company reached out while the officers worked. Kevin, the fleet contact listed in my driver's app, sent a message. "We were notified of an emergency on your trip. Please contact support." I called because I felt the obligation for a paper trail and maybe a human voice that knew the protocol. The company rep told me about a support line, about counseling resources, and about the process they would follow. Information sharing with authorities, temporarily deactivating any live features that could expose the incident, and an offer of assistance for the driver. They asked the same questions the police had asked: time of pickup, audio recordings, did I have anything? I told them I had not turned on any in-car recording devices. The car had no dashcam. There was an expression of empathy over the line and a routine verification that a flag had been placed on the trip. Local news began to show up. I remember reporter Jenna, who had been standing on the sidewalk under the overpass with a notepad, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She asked questions to anyone who would answer: neighbors, a nearby vendor who sold roasted nuts, one of the guys in a van who said he had seen the ambulance lights. The neighborhood has a way of rippling outwards. A story passes from person to person faster than the official channels. By morning, there would be a thread online, a headline that would say, "Driver finds passenger unresponsive," and a debate unfolding in the comments about safety, about app companies, about the outlines of lives you never fully know. In the immediate moment, though, there were smells and textures and the small practicalities of closure. The coroner's team asked if the vehicle could be towed. They arranged for a temporary seal, a formal incision into the quiet bureaucracy of a death. They removed the sheet with a care that was not performative. Officer Ramirez told me to write down everything I remembered and to stay available for contact. "We'll need your statement in case the medical examiner follows up," he said. Local news began to show up. I remember reporter Jenna, who had been standing on the sidewalk under the overpass with a notepad, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She asked questions to anyone who would answer: neighbors, a nearby vendor who sold roasted nuts, one of the guys in a van who said he had seen the ambulance lights. The neighborhood has a way of rippling outwards. A story passes from person to person faster than the official channels. By morning, there would be a thread online, a headline that would say, "Driver finds passenger unresponsive," and a debate unfolding in the comments about safety, about app companies, about the outlines of lives you never fully know. In the immediate moment, though, there were smells and textures and the small practicalities of closure. The coroner's team asked if the vehicle could be towed. They arranged for a temporary seal, a formal incision into the quiet bureaucracy of a death. They removed the sheet with a care that was not performative. Officer Ramirez told me to write down everything I remembered and to stay available for contact. "We'll need your statement in case the medical examiner follows up," he said. I wrote what I could while my hand shook. Pickup time, the route, the way he had said drive, the wetness at the mouth, the lack of response to attempts to rouse him. Statements are strange things. They try to put a life into narrative form before the body even leaves the scene. Someone asked his name. The app had him as Martin, a username attached to an account. That was what I could give them. It wasn't a full identity. Later, I would learn there had been identification through dental records, but in the night, that came later. In the shadow of the underpass, there was only the name on the phone and a man who had climbed into my car and gone still. The medical examiner's team labeled the case and took Martin away, and the city returned to its schedule of clatter and engines. Sitting in my empty car after the coroner closed the door, I thought of the ordinary rituals that it would take to make the night legible to me again. A hot cup of coffee, a phone call to Maria to say I was okay,
a drive home that doesn't require detours through underpasses. Maria had been my friend in the driving community for years. She'd taught me how to handle the small confrontations, which neighborhoods to avoid at certain hours, how to tilt a conversation away from someone who made you uncomfortable. I called her then, not yet ready to say the words, and she listened. "Breathe," she said, "the single useful thing a friend can tell you. Get off the road for a bit." Even before formal conclusions, something shifted in the ways drivers around the city spoke to each other. There were messages in the group chats, the same ones where someone posts a picture of a lost phone or warns about an area where police had been running license checks. People wrote, "Stay safe," and shared protocols. Keep the doors unlocked when you have time to open them for a rider. Always have your emergency button mapped. Consider dash cameras. I had thought myself cautious before, but the night rearranged the checklist in my head. The peppermint in the cup holder tasted like a placeholder for the unease settling into my chest. They told me later, as the police finalized the scene and the coroner put the paperwork into neat stacks, that the likely cause would be listed as cardiac arrest with contributing substances noted in medical reports. They told me this in the same patient tone in which they informed me that no criminal investigation would follow, the official classification, unattended death. That phrasing felt removing in one moment and final in another. It made sense of why there were no handcuffs, why no detective questioned motive with a lean toward malice. Even knowing that, the fact of a life stopping in the backseat of my car made the ordinary rituals of the city seem suddenly precarious. In the days afterward, I kept replaying small moments as if they were a film I could slow down and examine for a missed cue or a different choice.
The peppermint wrapper on the floor, the burn mark in the cup holder, the 3 minutes when I thought someone might wake, each detail became a stone I turned over in my mind. Marcus texted me once, "You did right. You called. You didn't move him." His voice carried a kind of civic solace I hadn't expected. Officer Ramirez emailed that the family's contact had been notified and that the case was being closed pending toxicology. Kevin from the company texted links to counseling resources and a note that the trip would be reviewed. They all used the language of logistics and care. But logistics don't account for the hush. After that night, I drove less. My hands felt different on the wheel, as if there was a memory lodged in my grip. I'd always known that driving could put you close to danger, bad neighborhoods, angry passengers, the occasional drunk. But proximity to death is different. It is quiet and patient and domestic. It is someone folding into your space and then not unfurling. The underpass case became a pivot in the local discourse. Reporters asked about policies and driver safety. City meetings discussed pilot programs for in-car recording and stronger emergency response buttons. Some drivers advocated for dash cams, others worried about privacy. I listened to both sides and tried to hold them together the way you try to keep two halves of a cracked cup from separating. For me, the immediate takeaway was practical and small. Keep documentation, use the emergency features, and know how to call for help. There was also a deeper takeaway that felt like a bruise. This work could put you in places where the ordinary stopped. As the weeks passed, small stories started to gather around the night under the overpass. A neighbor who marched in a community meeting said she had seen a man who looked like he'd been sleeping and had thought nothing of it. A local vendor recited the time the ambulance lights had thrown his sausages into a blue sheen. There was a thread online where commenters debated whether the driver had done something wrong or was simply unlucky. The chorus was familiar to anyone who lives their life exposed to the city's quick judgments. Versions of events proliferate, and people try to fit a messy human moment into a narrative that convenes neat blame. But the underpass night was only one of 3 rides that seemed to mark the same seam in the city's skin. Before Martin, there was the funeral drop with Leela. After some quiet weeks, there would be the man who whistled 3 notes, Jason, a small, eerie encounter that read differently after the underpass. For now, on that night under the highway, everything felt like it had been compressed into an urgent narrowness. My hands were still warm from the ignition.
The peppermint in the cup holder had melted into the crack around the lid. I thought of all the other cars on the road, each carrying an anonymous life.
At some point while the coroner made his notes, Officer Ramirez asked if I had anything else to add. I told him about Tom and Alina, about the small prelude to the night that had seemed ordinary in hindsight. He nodded the way someone who has heard that kind of thing before does and said, "You did right. You followed protocol." The phrase acted like an anchor. It steadied me in the immediate aftermath, even though it couldn't erase the picture my brain kept producing, a man who had sat in my car and gone still. That picture stayed with me in the days that followed in ways I didn't expect. I drove routes I knew but noticed different things. A man who always stood too close to a bus stop bench, a woman who perched on the back of a curb like a question. Ordinary faces acquired the weight of possibility. The city didn't get scarier, it got more precise. Small details that had once been noise became the textures I used to orient myself. One night, a week after the underpass, I picked up a woman named Leela at a funeral. She smelled of heavy perfume and had a faint lipstick on her cup of tea. The funeral had been for an older man in her congregation. She sat in the back seat with hands pressed so tight together I could see the white of her knuckles. She told me, in a voice that barely rose above the hum of the heater, that she kept seeing a man in the pews later. After the hush of the service had dispersed, she said she would see him again on the street, at the grocery store, as if he was following the arc of the grief. I didn't know yet to file that conversation next to the underpass. At the time, it was just an odd, melancholy thing you hear after funerals. She described him as having eyes that looked like glass. She said it once with the certainty of someone narrating a religious vision, and again, a few minutes later, with the doubt of someone wondering whether grief had its own private hallucinations. We talked quietly about how grief can rearrange perception, how a mind looking for meaning will sometimes see a pattern where there is none. She thanked me when we pulled up to her building and gave me a tip she said was for the trouble of listening. I pocketed the cash and the image slid into my memory as a small, strange thing, nothing like the gravity waiting under the highway. After that night, I began to notice those small, eerie ways the city tells you things. There is a whistled motif, for example, that has its own uncanny quality. A few notes repeated until the pattern becomes what it is. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but later, when a man in a suit named Jason got into my car and whistled the same 3 notes over and over, the detail felt loaded with a sense of kinship to the night beneath the overpass. Little things accumulate, and then one event reframes the rest. For now, as I sat in the quiet of my car with the evidence bagged and the coroner's team pulling down a tarp, I felt a pressure in my chest that wasn't quite panic and wasn't quite grief. It was the feeling of being the one who had to hold a story that didn't belong to me but was now attached to me. I tried not to think about the eventual formalities, the medical examiner's report, the possible toxicology, the family's notification. Those were things that would be resolved in the hospitals and offices of the city. My part was a sequence of minutes, a set of actions that had been recorded by a dispatcher and stamped into a file. Maria called me then, the streetwise friend who drove the night shift beside me and knew when a driver needed to be talked off a ledge. "Do you want to talk?" she asked. There is a power in being offered the simplest possible help, someone to hold a sentence with you. I told her about the wetness at the mouth and the peppermint and the burn mark. She listened and after a pause said, "Get a dash cam." It was pragmatic, not sentimental. "If nothing else, you'll want something for the record. And," she added, "get some rest." The night folded into morning. The underpass cleared. A tow truck hauled the car away with the kind of gentle, precise movements that make the world feel like it still has order. I drove home with the heater on high and my collar turned up against a wind that had somehow gained a heavier note. The city continued waking, and I felt like an island walking ashore. I kept turning over the scene in my mind, what I had missed, what I had done right, the small things I couldn't unsee. People would eventually ask for a description that made sense of events, and I wanted to make sure I could give it.
But in the immediate hours after, I held in my chest something that had weight but not yet a name. It felt less like closure and more like preamble, as if that night had nudged open a door I didn't know existed. The first block of this occurred in the space of minutes, and the rest of the life I'd known before it stretched behind me like something bright and ordinary. If this story is about the scariest rides I've had, the ride under the Kennedy overpass is the one that rewired the way I look at every other passenger. It took the ordinary plumbing of the night, playlist, small talk, peppermint, and showed me how quickly and quietly those details could be overtaken. If this is hitting where you live, if this is the kind of thing that makes you pause a late-night drive, stay with me. There are 2 more rides that night, smaller in one sense but just as defining in another. Before we move on, if you haven't already, consider subscribing for more true accounts. These stories matter when they're told in full. The second ride that still sits in my chest came much earlier in my driving life, the kind of thing you would file under strange but explainable until a night like the overpass made it mean more.
Leela's funeral ride later acquired weight because of what happened after Martin. At the time, though, it felt like the city revealing a small bruise. The man she said she kept seeing in pews, his eyes like glass, always in the same row, was the sort of detail you could rationalize as grief or as the mind's stray tendency to find patterns. But sometimes patterns have a way of connecting across time, and sometimes small details, like a whistle of 3 notes or a barely seen face in a church aisle, line up like teeth on a gear and make the machine of the night turn. There was no way I could see that then. I had a car to turn into a garage and a husband. No, I didn't. A sleep schedule to try to remember. I had to make the next decision a sensible one. Call Maria back, sleep, check the app's messages for any follow-ups, and think about installing a dash cam. The rational things you can do in the wake of the ridiculous are what hold you, and so I did them. But as my hands tightened around the steering wheel that night and the city slid by in a ribbon of light and noise, I realized that the work we do as drivers isn't just moving people. It's absorbing moments that weren't yours to begin with and then carrying them with you, often unbidden, long after the trip meter has run out. The underpass became a hinge. It paused me between who I was and who I would be the next night I landed a fare and heard the thin sound of a whistle through a closed window. The city kept going, and so I kept driving, but the streetlights and the playlists had changed. But as my hands tightened around the steering wheel that night and the city slid by in a ribbon of light and noise, I realized that the work we do as drivers isn't just moving people. It's absorbing moments that weren't yours to begin with and then carrying them with you, often unbidden, long after the trip meter has run out. The underpass became a hinge. It paused me between who I was and who I would be the next night I landed a fare and heard the thin sound of a whistle through a closed window. The city kept going, and so I kept driving, but the streetlights and the playlists had changed. Leela's story sits next in my mind like a weathered photograph, slightly out of focus, full of grain. She was older than most riders I took late at night, wrapped in a coat that smelled of strong perfume and cigarette smoke. The funeral had been for a man from her congregation. She climbed into the back seat with eyes that had been rubbed raw by tears. At the time, I filed her in the grief folder and drove on. After the underpass, that folder opened in a different way. She told me the man kept appearing in the pews. It wasn't just that she imagined a face where there was none. She insisted it was the same man, in the same row, sometimes leaning as if to whisper into the air. I kept thinking I'd missed something at the service, she said, voice small. But then I'd see him on Clark Street or at the bakery, and he'd be there. She said the words slow, like a person trying them on for weight. She described his eyes as glassy and his posture as wrong for a living body, too still, as if he were a mannequin with someone's coat draped over it. I remember looking in the rearview mirror at the way her hands trembled on her knees and telling myself plausible things. Grief rearranges the world, I thought. The brain, hungry for meaning, fills in blanks. I offered a truth that was useful and small.
Sometimes the mind remembers the last thing it wants to hold on to. She nodded, let out a sound that might have been a laugh, might have been a sob, and then asked me to wait while she smoked a cigarette on the stoop of her building. When she came back, she tipped me extra and said, "Thank you for listening," like listening had been a service worth paying for. It was only later, when the image of Martin under the overpass wouldn't let me rest, that Leela's description kept surfacing. The way she said, glass, it had a dryness to it that planted itself in my head. Once, walking down to the grocery after a shift, I paused at a church entrance and scanned the rows. For a flash, my brain supplied an outline in a pew, head tilted the wrong way. I had to stop myself from stepping inside to look. That would have been an odd, invasive thing. Instead, I kept walking and tried to catalog why Leela's story had the power to stay. It was the certainty in the voice, the way grief can be a lens that tints ordinary sights into a pattern that feels like fate. The second vignette that lines up with the underpass isn't about death directly. It's about a sound that lodged in my chest and refused to leave. Jason was clean-cut, wore a suit that fit like it had been chosen the way someone chooses a mask. He climbed in with a clipped "thanks" and the smell of cheap aftershave. What made him stand out, at least at first, was his whistle. 3 notes, precise and unemphatic, repeated at soft intervals like a metronome. It was impossible to pin down whether it was an idle habit or a signal. It had the antiseptic repetition of something practiced. He whistled the pattern under his breath the entire ride. Not loudly, never loud enough to be rude, but constant enough to make it into the background air of the car. At one point, I glanced at him in the side mirror and noticed his teeth. They were very white, an almost unnatural bright that caught the sodium light. That detail lodged itself in the mechanics of how my unease built. Pristine teeth, a calm mechanical whistle, hands folded as if in a display case. He didn't ask to change the music or talk. When I asked for the address, he tapped the screen, never looked up, and the whistle slid on. The ride ended at an office building downtown. He slipped out without fanfare, handed me an exact bill for the fare, and nodded once. The whistle faded with his door closing. I thought about the way the sound had made the space feel measured, like a clock running and reminding me of the hour. At the time, I filed it as odd and kept moving. After the underpass, that 3-note motif began to itch at the back of my mind. Little things stack, small dissonances find each other over time, and when you arrange them, you get a pattern that feels less accidental. Those 2 vignettes, Leela's man in the pews and Jason's repeating whistle, are not the same as Martin under the overpass. They didn't end in sirens or coroner bags. But they were the same kind of cracks. Brief moments when the banal texture of the night peeled and revealed something raw underneath. I remember thinking that after the underpass, my appetite for pattern making had increased. My memory sharpened into an inventory of places to look for the uncanny. The aisle of a church, a corner by a hot dog cart, the back seat of my car between midnight and 3 a.m. The weeks after the coroner labeled Martin's death as probable cardiac arrest with contributing substances were bureaucratically tidy and humanly messy. Detective Lewis called me twice. His voice was patient, neither accusatory nor effusive. He spoke in the measured language of someone who balances paperwork with grief. He told me they had matched the trip on the app to the GPS trace and that dental records had provided a name beyond Martin. He said toxicology would take time and that their office would contact me if anything untoward appeared. The last time he called, he said the medical examiner's report supported an unattended death and that no criminal charges would be filed. It appears to be natural causes complicated by substances, he said, and then asked the same practical questions about statements and contact information. Those calls were a strange solace, an official end to a scene that felt otherwise endless. Yet the closure on paper didn't close what had lodged in me. I kept dreaming in shallow loops, a man in a leather coat who didn't wake up, the whistle as if it were a chorus in an empty hallway, church light pooling on a pew, and a figure that might or might not be there. I found myself replaying the dispatcher's voice, the feel of the phone, the physical detail of the wetness at Martin's mouth. Memory, I discovered, doesn't tidy itself like a file. It sits in the body. The company did what companies tend to do. They followed protocol. Kevin sent a message, more formal after the initial outreach, with links to counseling numbers and a brief generic-sounding note about support. They offered paid time off, at least for a short period, and assured me that the trip and its records would be handled according to policy. There were polite check-ins, a one-time offer to cover an intake session with a counselor, and an internal review of how the emergency features worked that night. Those calls were a strange solace, an official end to a scene that felt otherwise endless. Yet the closure on paper didn't close what had lodged in me. I kept dreaming in shallow loops, a man in a leather coat who didn't wake up, the whistle as if it were a chorus in an empty hallway, church light pooling on a pew, and a figure that might or might not be there. I found myself replaying the dispatcher's voice, the feel of the phone, the physical detail of the wetness at Martin's mouth. Memory, I discovered, doesn't tidy itself like a file. It sits in the body. The company did what companies tend to do. They followed protocol. Kevin sent a message, more formal after the initial outreach, with links to counseling numbers and a brief generic-sounding note about support. They offered paid time off, at least for a short period, and assured me that the trip and its records would be handled according to policy. There were polite check-ins, a one-time offer to cover an intake session with a counselor, and an internal review of how the emergency features worked that night. Maria recommended a counselor she trusted. The session felt like unpacking a suitcase you'd been hauling behind you without noticing the weight. I learned to name what I had been holding: an intrusive image, a pressure in my chest when I heard sirens, the jump when someone knocked on my car window. Those were the symptoms that other drivers described too. People called it different things: PTSD light, secondhand trauma, but whatever the label, the effect was real. We started an informal chain of support: text threads where someone would check in after a late shift, a buddy system for drivers who felt uncomfortable in certain neighborhoods. None of it replaced the awkward human thing of being present for the person who had to hold that night. It softened the edges. Months later, when the local news ran a short piece on policy changes that had been accelerated after the incident, reporter Jenna asked if I'd talk on camera. I declined. There is a difference between giving a statement and being put under a light to narrate the night as a spectacle. Reporter Jenna had been at the overpass. She'd scribbled in the cold, and later her piece had both sympathy and the kind of distance a newscaper needs to maintain. She asked if anything about the experience had changed my view of riders. I told her the truth. It had. Not because I thought the city was suddenly more dangerous, but because I could no longer treat the people who slid into my back seat as background. They have edges. They are, each of them, larger than the moment their trip lasted. I learned procedural things I wish I had known earlier. For example, when you find someone unresponsive, keep the vehicle stable and call 911 immediately. The dispatcher will coach you through what you can safely do. Use your app's emergency button. It's not a substitute for 911, but it creates a time-stamped trail and alerts company safety teams. If possible, document the scene. Take a few photos of the vehicle's position and of anything that seems relevant, but wait for the police before moving or touching potential evidence. Give your statement honestly and calmly. It will be needed for coroner work and any review. If you're a driver, reach out to your management and ask for guidance on counseling. These resources exist and they matter. And finally, confide in another driver or a friend. Holding it alone compounds the tension. There are things I still do automatically now. Check the back seat between fares, keep the passenger side window cracked when safe to do so, map out exits before a passenger climbs in at odd hours, and keep the emergency numbers visible on the dashboard. I also try, deliberately, to keep perspective. The majority of rides go without incident. Most people are tired or distracted or grateful. Sometimes you pick up a student, sometimes someone rushing from rehearsal. But the possibility that an ordinary moment could become enormous is real, and treating it as a possibility is what keeps you prepared. The quietest part of processing has been reconciling my responsibility as a driver with the reality of what happened. I rehearsed what-if scenarios until they were worn smooth. What if I'd noticed the wetness sooner? What if I'd attempted compressions in the car? But those hypotheticals dissolve when I go back to the facts I have. I called 911. I used the emergency button. I did not move the passenger, and I waited for EMTs and police. Procedure matters because it protects everyone involved, driver, passenger, and the main thing that bears on any future inquiries, the truth of the timeline. I also had to accept that some parts of the story would remain unsettled. Leela's man might have been grief's pattern making. Jason's whistle might have been an idle habit of someone who likes repetition. Martin's death had a label in a report that made sense of the immediate practical questions. But labels don't fully absorb the human things. The image of a man in your car, the way a dispatcher's voice threads through your memory, the small kindnesses from strangers like Marcus banging on the window. Those human moments kept me honest and kept me from becoming a shell of fear. When the weeks turned into months, I found a rhythm again. I drove less often at the very late night hours, not out of fear, but out of self-care. I worked the evening shift more. It paid less in surge, but felt manageable in terms of emotional load. The dashcam gathered unremarkable footage of streets and stoplights, the kind that reassures you more than it thrills. I met with a counselor twice more and learned techniques to ground myself when I started to spin into memory. Breathing exercises, a way to name the image and file it mentally instead of letting it loop in a way that sours the day. The community changed too, in quiet, practical ways. The pilot dashcam committee that started at the neighborhood meeting led to a small grant program for drivers who couldn't afford equipment. The local app liaison moved up the timeline for an interface tweak that made the emergency button both more prominent and faster to trigger. None of that fixed what happened, none of it would bring a life back. But it created structures that made drivers feel less alone, and made the city account for a rare but heavy possibility. People sometimes ask me if I would have driven that night differently if I'd known how it would end. It's an unfair question. You can smooth your actions with hindsight, but at the time, you're making decisions inside a small cockpit of limited information. The most practical answer I can give is to prepare and to be honest with yourself. Learn the basics of first aid. Keep your phone charged and accessible. Make the emergency features on the app a reflex, and build a support net with other drivers or friends who understand the peculiar burden of our work. I think about Martin sometimes not as a set of facts, but as a way the city taught me to be smaller about assumptions. He was a person who climbed into a car and did not get back out. The rest of the city carried on as if that wasn't an extraordinary seam in the night. That is both a mercy and a kind of cruelty. It means the work goes on and that memory softens with time. It also means the urgency of that moment can be folded into a list of safety items and then, if you're not careful, forgotten. If there is one lesson threading these three rides, the underpass, the funeral, the whistle, it's that normal can peel away quickly. The ordinary, the peppermint gum, the playlist, the student with a sandwich, gives you a baseline for noticing when something goes wrong. But the city will always be a place where shadows and patterns can align, sometimes without consequence, and sometimes with a consequence you can't undo. The responsibility you carry as a driver is real, and learning how to hold it without letting it hollow you out is the slow work. If this account strikes a chord with you, please share a line in the comments in this format. I was in my car, month, one sentence feeling. It helps us keep a record of the ways driving touches lives, and it lets others know they're not the only ones who carried a night home. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more true accounts. Stories that matter are the ones we pass along, carefully and honestly.